Welcome back. My next guest, he won one of the most closely watched Senate races in the country last year. Doug Jones, a Democrat who was able to win in deep red Alabama. And since it was a special election, he will be defending that seat come next year. Senator, he's also the author of the new book, Bending Towards Justice, the Birmingham Church bombing that changed the course of civil rights. Senator Jones, he joins us now. Senator, thank you for the time.
Hey, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
You know, I went down to Alabama, and not in the context of going to Birmingham, but more as a meeting point to see my first SEC game down in Tuscaloosa. But in Birmingham, I happened over to the site of the 16th Street Church, and I did know, I knew of the historical significance, but the adjoining park and what it also mentioned, there was an African-American man, probably in his late 80s, who asked if I wanted to hear from history from a person who was there, and he walked me through not just that awful day, but the significance in that. And you tell that in your book, but I don't think people can appreciate, unless they lived in that part of the country then and even now, how much of, not just of a raw nerve that was, but also a turning point in civil rights and how much it still resonates today. Do your best, if you could, to articulate, because it's a through point throughout your whole professional life, just why that wasn't one bombing, it was so much more.
Sure. 1963 was a huge year for both Alabama and America. I mean, Birmingham had seen any number of problems in civil rights. We had seen any number of bombings over the course of a number of years. At one point, Freedom Riders came through Birmingham and were beaten up at the Greyhound bus station, where our police commissioner, Bull Connor, allowed them to arrive without any police protection or escort for 20 minutes so the Klan could have their way with them. And so it was in 1962 in the fall where citizens of Birmingham decided to change the form of government, and things began to make a change. But it was the spring of 1963 when Dr. King, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and others brought the movement to Birmingham in that spring in what's now known as the Children's Crusade. It was at first called Project C, Project Confrontation. Dr. King, Reverend Abernathy, Reverend Shuttlesworth, all participated in those marches initially in the spring of 1963. They went to jail, and that's when Dr. King penned the famous letter from a Birmingham jail, which I think everybody should read, which we read on the floor of the U.S. Senate recently, as a matter of fact. And after that settlement was reached, you saw a number of things happen, and you had to stand in the schoolhouse door just 60 miles away in Tuscaloosa at the University of Alabama. You had more homes being bombed in Birmingham throughout the course of that summer, and Medgar Evers was murdered in Mississippi. But there was also a desegregation school case that was ongoing that finally came to a head in the fall, in like August of 1963, and the Birmingham City Schools were ordered to be desegregated. And that really had, Birmingham was really like a powder keg. I mean, no pun intended that way, but it was a real bubbling cauldron that culminated in that bombing that happened. And the fire hoses and the dogs that had occurred were right across the street at the 16th Street Baptist Church, because in the spring when the Project C, the Children's Crusade, started, they met at the church. They met at the 16th Street Baptist Church, and they no sooner got across the street into that park, into the road where the dogs and the fire hoses met them. So what happened in that spring is that the children of Birmingham and that church really became symbols of the movement. As much as Dr. King and others, they became a symbol of the movement that resulted in the bombing on September 15th, just 5 days after Birmingham City Schools were integrated for the first time.
And you know that famous expression, the past serving as prelude. We're seeing some ugly voices, and I think the first time in my lifetime, you seem to see a sense of going back or backwards. You've seen all the data points. We've seen some of the incendiary comments, even from the Oval. Do you feel a sense of that when you were writing about that chapter in history and the progresses that have been made? In many ways, we're going back and some of the same voices that were tamped down because they think they have a bigger audience. Do you sense that as well?
Yeah, no, I do believe that we've slid backwards, not only in race relations between black and white, but also other nationalities and races and religions this day. When we did this book, I mean, it was a long time in the making. And we actually rewrote the ending several times before, because things that we were sounding the alarm bells on came to pass. For instance, we saw the rhetoric. And in Birmingham in the 1960s, we saw the hateful rhetoric of George Wallace, Bull Connor, and others. And I believe that contributed to the violence that occurred in Birmingham. And we started seeing that same rhetoric with regard to immigration and other issues. And lo and behold, we have a Charleston shooting where 9 people are killed in a black church. And Dylan Roof is talking about trying to start a race war. That's some of the same language that we heard. And so we had to kind of relook at things. I think we've been sliding back. I think a lot of it is because of immigration that started at a low point in our economy when people were concerned about jobs. And I also think that we've slid back because of voting rights, political power. And we've seen a concerted effort around the country to try to stop people from voting and exercising their right to get to the ballot box. And that's been a political discrimination, not the kind of racial discrimination that we saw in the 50s and 60s, but a political discrimination that has the effect of racial discrimination. So yeah, I still worry about it. And I think we're spreading it now. I think you saw what happened in New Zealand, but hate seems to be taking over a lot these days. And we've got to kind of dial back that rhetoric to try to stop it.
Senator, you're speaking to an East Coast audience here, up along, as they say, the Amtrak rail. For a lot of us, we would think in a place like Alabama that with the non-Christian storylines and words that'll come from a president and manufacturing certainly taking a beating, as well as the agricultural sector with the latest turn on the tariffs, that patience would be really running thin with the president. But it seems to be counter to that when you look at the numbers. Can you explain why?
Well, I think it's wearing thin. I don't think it's there now. And, people, folks all over, not just the South, but I think people that supported someone to begin with, want to give them the benefit of the doubt. They want to believe that they were correct in making the decisions that they made. But I do believe that that is wearing thin at this point. I believe that folks were looking to see a new face. They were looking to try to shake things up. They wanted people to listen to them. They liked the fact that Donald Trump talked in language that was not necessarily politically correct. But now they're seeing something different. And I think there's still this inherent quality of people, especially in the South, to try to give people the benefit of the doubt, to see how things go. And they just don't want to, kind of come to terms with the fact that this is not working out the way that they thought.
Finally, you were, before you came to Washington, you were one time U.S. attorney down in Alabama. In fact, you shepherded some of the convictions of those remaining members at that Birmingham bombing. So you come to Washington, and I'm just curious, in your short time there, with what's going on with your colleagues in the Senate, primarily on the other side of the aisle, Joe Manchin said he doesn't recognize Lindsey Graham anymore. He was a jag. Nobody has to educate Lindsey Graham on the rule of law, but like so many, they give so many passes and obfuscate what the role of you guys are, which is you're supposed to be our check and balance, in part on the executive branch. Do you believe what you're saying since you've gotten to Washington on this? And seemingly that subpoenas don't matter anymore, and the biggest job of the AG is now we have to go look at the investigators rather than what Mueller found. It does not make sense to a lot of us who say, what the heck is going up on the Hill?
Well, I do think we're living in a different world, and I do think that President Trump has pretty much dominated the Republican Party, and it's a new world for them. They're not exactly sure what to make of it, but I have been complaining a lot that it doesn't appear that Congress has been doing its job to be an independent branch of government. We're not doing it on nominations. We're not doing it on other things. We don't see things coming to the Senate floor for votes. We're not the deliberative body that everybody expects it to be, and it's just it's a different world. I think the Republicans are having a harder time adjusting to this than Democrats, because we're in the minority party. We can't control the floor. We can only do our talk, and we don't have the debates that we used to. But I will say this. I do think there's a lot more bipartisanship that goes on in the Senate than people see. You look at C-SPAN and you look at the speeches, and you would think all we do is fight and point the fingers at each other. That's not necessarily the case when it comes to legislation. Most of the legislation that's introduced in the Senate is actually bipartisan legislation with both Republican and Democratic sponsors. It's just that we can't get it to the floor.
Senator, I want to thank you for the time. And again, the book is Bending Towards Justice, the Birmingham Church Bombing that changed the course of civil rights. Senator, thank you.
Thank you. My pleasure.
All right, everybody, when we come back, we're going to try and separate some fact from fiction about the trade war with China. The president says you as consumers, you and me, well, we won't get hurt by this whole process. China will pay for it. But we're going to show you why that, frankly, is fake news.